Hi everyone, welcome back. We've got a brand new story to share with you. So let's begin. Some betrayals cut so deep that they change the very foundation of who you are. No man goes into a marriage with a thought that they would be dealing with infidelity of their wives. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. What happened to my marriage didn't just end a relationship. It transformed me into someone I barely recognized. My name is Gavin, and I had been married to Alice for 8 years when everything fell apart on what should have been an ordinary afternoon. For 8 years of our marriage, I believed it was a solid partnership, built on trust, love, and mutual respect. She had been a stay-at-home wife for most of our marriage, which was a decision we made together when I started earning enough to support both of us comfortably. I worked long hours as a financial consultant, often leaving early in the morning and returning home well into the evening. Our neighborhood was the kind of place where everyone knew each other. Friendly waves across driveways, casual conversations over fence lines, and the occasional barbecue invitation. It was a safe, quiet community where I thought nothing bad could happen. Our next-door neighbor, Jeff, was a divorced man in his early 40s who worked from home as a freelance graphic designer. He seemed friendly enough, always willing to help with small favors or lend a hand with tools when needed. Looking back now, I can see the signs I chose to ignore. The way Alice would mention Jeff's name a little too often in casual conversation. She always seemed to know the details about his schedule or his latest projects. It's crazy to think about it right now, but she seems to dress a bit nicer on days when she mentioned running into him while getting the mail or working in the yard. But at the time, I was too trusting, too focused on my own work and responsibilities to notice that something might be going on right under my nose. I believed in the foundation of our marriage so completely that the possibility of betrayal never seriously crossed my mind. On the particular day, everything fell apart. I had finished a client meeting earlier than expected. Instead of heading back to the office, I decided to surprise Alice by coming home for lunch. I thought it would be a nice gesture. Maybe we could order takeout together if she didn't have anything already prepared and spend some quality time that we rarely had during my busy workdays. Instead of driving into the garage, I pulled into our driveway, which requires me to walk a bit into the house around 1:30 in the afternoon. I noted that Jeff's car was also in his driveway. Nothing unusual about that, since he worked from home most days. I entered through the front door quietly, hoping to catch Alice by surprise that I am home early. There was no sight of her around, which I initially attributed to her possibly being in the shower or having stepped out briefly. But as I moved through the house, I heard sounds coming from upstairs. I couldn't make sense of this sound, but it is suspicious. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. The sounds became clearer as I approached our bedroom, and what I heard left no room for misinterpretation. My wife was being intimate with another man in our marital bed. They were carried away in their passion, that none of them heard the small noises I made while coming up. I stood outside the bedroom door for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, trying to process what I was hearing. Part of my mind was desperately searching for alternative explanations, but the reality was undeniable. When I finally pushed open the bedroom door, the scene that greeted me was worse than anything I could have imagined. Alice was in bed with Jeff, and they were so absorbed in what they were doing that they still didn't immediately notice my presence. The rage that filled me was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was a white-hot fury that seemed to consume every rational thought in my head. I had never been a violent person, never been in a physical fight since elementary school. But in that moment, I lost complete control of myself. I lunged at Jeff with a ferocity that surprised even me. We crashed to the floor beside the bed, and I began hitting him with everything I had. My fists connected with his face and torso repeatedly as he tried to defend himself and escape. Alice was screaming, but her voice seemed to come from very far away. Jeff managed to break free from my assault and scrambled for his clothes. His face was bloodied, and he was moving frantically to get dressed and get out of the house. I was still in a rage-fueled state, following him and shouting threats that I don't even fully remember. He managed to escape through the front door, running toward his own house while still pulling on his shirt. I stood in my doorway, breathing heavily and watching him flee, my knuckles scraped and bloody from the confrontation. When I turned back into the house, Alice was standing at the top of the stairs, hastily dressed and crying hysterically. The sight of her tears did nothing to diminish my anger. If anything, it intensified my sense of betrayal and disgust. I looked up at her and said the words that would end our marriage. I told her this marriage was over. My voice was cold and flat, completely devoid of the emotion that was raging inside me. She tried to say something, but I turned away and walked to my study. The study became my refuge over the following days and weeks. It was the one room in the house that felt untainted by what had happened. I spent most of my time there when I am not at the office. I would be working, reading, or simply sitting in silence and trying to process the destruction of my life as I had known it. Alice tried to talk to me repeatedly during this period, but I found myself unable and unwilling to engage with her. When she would approach me or try to start a conversation, I would simply ignore her presence. The woman I had loved and trusted had become a stranger to me, someone whose voice I could no longer bear to hear. I threw myself into the practical aspects of ending our marriage with the same intensity one had once brought to building it. I immediately contacted a divorce attorney and began the process of legally dissolving our union. My lawyer was efficient and thorough, understanding that I wanted the process completed as quickly as the legal system would allow. I didn't know what happened to Jeff after that day. I suspected he had moved out of the place. I had expected him to press charges, but he didn't. I watched to see what came out of his end, but there was nothing. The initial divorce papers were filed within 2 weeks, which my attorney explained was relatively fast, given the complexity of our financial situation and the need to properly document everything. When I presented the filed papers to Alice several weeks later, her reaction was immediate and dramatic. She broke down into another round of begging and pleading that was painful to witness, but did nothing to change my resolve. She claimed that it was the devil that had led her to cheating, that she had been tempted beyond her ability to resist, that it was a moment of weakness that meant nothing compared to our years together. She swore that she loved only me and that Jeff meant nothing to her. But her explanations fell on deaf ears. The trust that had been the foundation of our relationship was completely destroyed. Whether her affair was the result of temptation, weakness, or deliberate choice didn't matter to me. The fact remained that she had made the decision to betray our marriage vows in the most intimate way possible. Despite her pleading and promises to change, the divorce proceedings began. The legal process was complicated by the fact that Alice had been a stay-at-home wife for most of our marriage. She was entitled to a significant settlement since she had no independent income or career to fall back on. I made the decision to pay her a large lump sum settlement rather than commit to monthly alimony payments. This choice was practical. I wanted to make a clean break and avoid ongoing financial entanglement. The judge wanted her to rebuild her life without needing to depend on me for support. I know how some people would feel about this because she cheated and still got paid. I don't feel good about paying someone who destroyed what we are building, but this is how the law works. The settlement was substantial enough for her to figure out her next steps. Some might have considered it overly generous given the circumstances, but I had been with this woman for 8 years, and despite her betrayal, the law didn't want her to suffer financially. However, my legal team's approach regarding the house was more complex. While I had owned the property before our marriage, the reality was that after 8 years together, it had become significantly entangled with our marital finances. My attorney worked to demonstrate that I had made the majority of mortgage payments and home improvements from my separate income, but we knew the house would likely still be subject to some division. Through careful negotiation and documentation, we were able to reach a settlement where I would keep the house, but Alice would receive additional compensation in other assets to balance the arrangement. This meant her overall settlement was significant, but it allowed me to maintain ownership of the home that represented stability in my life. This arrangement was both practical and symbolic. The house represented stability and continuity in my life, and losing it would have felt like losing the last tangible piece of my pre-betrayal existence. Watching Alice pack her belongings and leave our home was one of the most difficult experiences of my life. Despite everything that had happened, despite the anger and hurt I felt, there was still a part of me that loved the woman I had thought she was. Personally, I had an incredibly hard time keeping my emotions in check throughout this entire period. The rage that had initially consumed me gradually gave way to a deep, persistent sadness. I had genuinely loved Alice, had envisioned spending the rest of my life with her, and the loss of that future was devastating. There were nights when I would sit in my study and remember happier times. Our wedding day, vacations we had taken together, quiet evenings spent talking about our dreams and plans. These memories were now tainted by the knowledge of her betrayal, but they still held emotional power over me. The internal conflict between my love for her and my anger at her actions was exhausting. I found myself cycling between rage, sadness, and a strange kind of numbness that served as a defense mechanism against the overwhelming emotions. I wonder how long she has been bringing another man into our bedroom. It was hard to make sense of why she would even cheat on me. Yes, I work hard, but I also spare some time to be with her. After the divorce was finalized, I made a conscious decision to focus exclusively on my work. I threw myself into my career with an intensity that bordered on obsession, taking on additional clients and working longer hours than ever before. I refused to consider dating or forming new romantic relationships. The idea of trusting another woman with my heart seemed impossible after what Alice had done. I built walls around myself emotionally, deciding that professional success and financial security were safer pursuits than love. After a while, my friends and family occasionally tried to encourage me to start dating again, but I consistently declined their suggestions and invitations. I had been burned so badly by Alice's betrayal that I couldn't imagine opening myself up to that kind of vulnerability again. The months passed in a blur of work, solitude, and gradual healing. I developed new routines that didn't include any woman, slowly reclaiming spaces in the house that had once been shared. I redecorated the bedroom completely and swapped out certain furniture, unable to sleep in the same space where I had discovered her infidelity. I found some peace in the predictability of my new life. Work during the week, household projects on weekends, occasional dinners with friends who understood my need for emotional distance. It wasn't a life I had planned, but it was stable and free from the kind of devastating surprises that had destroyed my marriage. Over a year passed in this manner. I had settled into my new reality and begun to think that I might be content with a life lived on my own terms, without the complications and vulnerabilities that came with romantic relationships. Then, on a Sunday morning in late spring, something happened. This has been about a year since I finalized my divorce from Alice. I was in my kitchen, preparing coffee and reading the newspaper, when I heard a knock on my front door. It was unusual to have visitors so early on a Sunday morning, and I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, I found Alice standing on my doorstep. She looked different than she had a year ago. She was dressed simply but neatly, and she appeared nervous and uncertain. It made sense that she was likely the one person who would know that the easiest time to get to me would be on an early Sunday morning. She asked if she could come in, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. The sight of her standing there brought back a flood of memories and emotions that I thought I had successfully buried. For a moment, I was transported back to happier times when seeing her face would have been the highlight of my day. But those feelings were quickly overshadowed by the reminder of why our marriage had ended. I remained standing in the doorway, not inviting her in, waiting to hear what she had to say. She had thought that after a year from the divorce, my stance would have softened, but she was wrong about that. Time had not healed the wound of her betrayal. If anything, it had crystallized my understanding of what she had taken from me. Alice began to speak, and what followed was a lengthy apology and plea for reconsideration. She told me that she had spent the entire year thinking about what she had done and regretting her actions. She claimed that not a day had passed without her wishing she could undo her betrayal and return to our life together. She described the loneliness and regret that had consumed her since our divorce. She talked about how she had tried to move on with her life, but couldn't escape the knowledge that she had destroyed the best thing that had ever happened to her. Alice acknowledged that she had no right to ask for forgiveness or another chance after what she had done. She understood that her actions had been unforgivable, and that I had every right to never want to see her again. But despite understanding all of this, she said she had to try. She couldn't live with herself if she didn't at least attempt to see if there was any possibility of redemption or reconciliation. She wasn't asking me to marry her again, she explained. She understood that our marriage was over and that there was no going back to what we had been. But she was asking me to consider giving her another chance to be part of my life in some capacity. She talked about how much she still loved me, and how the year apart had made her realize that I was the only man she had ever truly loved or ever would love. She promised that she had learned from her mistakes, and that she would spend the rest of her life making up for what she had done if I would let her. I listened to everything she had to say without interrupting. Part of me was curious to hear her perspective and to understand what had driven her to show up at my door after all this time. Another part of me was simply stunned by her presence and needed time to process the unexpected encounter. Her words were heartfelt and appeared genuine. I could see the pain and regret in her eyes, and I believed that she was truly sorry for what she had done. The year apart had clearly been difficult for her, and she seemed to understand the gravity of her actions in a way that she perhaps hadn't immediately after our divorce. But understanding and regretting her actions didn't change what she had done. It didn't undo the betrayal or restore the trust that had been shattered. It didn't erase the image of finding her in bed with another man or the pain I had endured in the aftermath. When she finished speaking, I took a moment to consider my response. I wanted to be clear and definitive, leaving no room for misinterpretation or false hope. I told her no. The word came out simply and firmly, without anger or emotion. I explained that while I appreciated her apology and could see that she was genuinely sorry, too much had been broken for there to be any possibility of reconciliation. I told her that what she had done had changed me fundamentally, and that I was no longer the man who could trust her or anyone else with that kind of vulnerability. The betrayal had taught me that the kind of love and trust we had shared was too dangerous for me to risk again. I made it clear that this wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was simply about self-preservation and the recognition that some bridges, once burned, cannot be rebuilt. Finally, I told her that she should never show up at my house again. I explained that seeing her was painful for both of us and served no constructive purpose. I asked her to respect my boundaries and allow both of us to move forward with our separate lives. Alice began crying as I spoke, and her tears continued as she accepted my decision. She nodded through her sobs, acknowledging my request that she not return. She thanked me for listening to her and apologized once more before turning to leave. I watched her walk to her car and drive away, knowing that it would likely be the last time I ever saw her. The encounter had been emotionally draining, but it had also provided a sense of closure that I hadn't realized I needed. In the days that followed, I reflected on Alice's visit and my response to it. I wondered if I had been too harsh or if there might have been some middle ground that could have allowed for some form of forgiveness without full reconciliation. But ultimately, I concluded that I had made the right decision. The trust that had been broken was too fundamental to our relationship to be repaired. The love I had felt for her was real, but it wasn't enough to overcome the knowledge of what she was capable of doing to someone who loved her. The experience reinforced my decision to remain single and focus on other aspects of my life. I had built a good life for myself in the year since our divorce, and I saw no reason to risk that stability for the uncertain possibility of redemption. Alice's visit had reminded me of both the love we had shared and the pain she had caused. It served as a final chapter to our story, providing the closure needed to fully move forward with my life. I never saw or heard from her again after that Sunday morning. I hoped that she was able to find peace and happiness in her own life, but I knew that our paths were permanently diverged. The man who had loved her unconditionally was gone, replaced by someone who had learned the hard way that some betrayals are simply unforgivable. Looking back now, I can see that Alice's affair didn't just end our marriage. It ended my belief in the kind of love that makes you completely vulnerable to another person. Whether that's a loss or a form of protection is something I'm still trying to understand, but it's become a fundamental part of who I am now. The experience taught me that love and trust are separate things, and that it's possible to love someone while recognizing that they're not safe to trust. It's a hard lesson, but one that has shaped my approach to relationships and life in general. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had given Alice another chance, if there might have been a way to rebuild what we had lost. But I know that the man who opened that door on Sunday morning was not the same man who had married her 8 years earlier. The betrayal had changed me in ways that made reconciliation impossible, regardless of how much either of us might have wanted it. That's the real tragedy of infidelity. It doesn't just destroy relationships, it destroys the people capable of having those relationships. The trusting, vulnerable person I had been was a casualty of Alice's affair, and no amount of apology or regret could bring him back.